Hello and welcome to another episode of Canada mit C, or in English, Canada with a C. My name is Annika Vaikinnes. I'm the project manager of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Canada. Today's episode is about the complexity of European identity, its historical and contemporary significance, and the evolving transatlantic relations between Canada and Europe. And this episode's expert who will shed light on this complex topic is Dr. Russell Foster. Dr. Foster was a Konrad Adenauer visiting scholar on transatlantic relations from September to December 2023 at Carleton University in Ottawa. The Konrad Adenauer Visiting Scholarship on Transatlantic Relations is a joint initiative by the Centre for European Studies at Carleton University and the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Canada. Dr. Foster is currently a lecturer in British and European politics at King's College London in the United Kingdom. His research investigates how the clash between subnational, national and metanational identities in Europe shapes policy decisions. He is particularly interested in the recent rise of Euroscepticism and populism in European nations, and how imaginations of Europe influence public reactions to European strategies and policies. Thank you, Dr. Foster, for joining today's episode of Canada mit C. The interview will be conducted by Dr. Norbert Eschborn, Director of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Canada. Norbert, over to you now.
Welcome, Dr. Russell Foster, to this podcast. You have been dealing for a long time with questions of European history and European identity. How would you explain to a Canadian what European identity actually is and why it is still meaningful in our time?
Well, thank you very much for having me today and for starting off with the hardest question. This is the one of the most frequently asked questions that we get, those of us who study identity, who research its significance. Why does it matter? What is it and why does it matter? To take the first one, what is a European identity? Well, a simple answer is that we can't agree on what this is. One thing that we can agree on is that there are multiple different European identities, but what it means will vary very significantly from one person to another. So we could take as an example of this my own country, where 8 years ago we voted to leave the European Union. Now, even the Leave campaign, we're not saying we're going to cease being European, we're just going to be a different type of European. So we get multiple different manifestations of what a European identity could be. To some people, it is synonymous with the European Union, with being a member of the EU. We saw this being very significant in the Big Bang enlargement of the European Union in the early noughties, around 20 years ago, when societies that were breaking free from the shackles of the Kremlin saw membership in the European Union as a return to Europe, a return home, coming back to a European identity. So for many people around the world, it's synonymous with being a member of the European Union. But it can also be so much larger than that. So the British are still Europeans, even though we're not EU-Europeans. Iceland, Switzerland, Norway are in a very similar position. We can see a European identity manifesting among Ukrainians who are not members of the European Union, but again, like in the early 2000s, perceive Europe as being a bastion of freedom and civilization. But it can also have a darker element to it, that there can be a more sinister version of a European identity. We can see this manifesting in identarianism or identitarianism, which are these somewhat thrawn ideologies which posit a European identity as essentially being white. And this is a phenomenon which is not new. It's been around for hundreds of years, this concept. But it's something that we thought was going away in the late 20th, early 21st centuries. But sorry, I live on a main road, but it's coming. We thought it was going away in the late 90s, in the early 2000s. It never really went away. It was always there, bubbling beneath the surface, but now it's making a comeback. So, for example, today is St. George's Day in the United Kingdom, and in London today, just a few miles from where I am now, there were big clashes between the police and essentially thugs, a lot of sort of skinhead neo-Nazi types who perceive a European identity which is a mirror opposite of the European identity that Ursula von der Leyen would promulgate. So a very long-winded answer to it. There are multiple different European identities. There is a big debate on how old European identity is. Is this something that goes back to the age of discovery with Christopher Columbus? Is this something that goes back to the ancient world, to the Romans and the Greeks? It's not a debate that's going to be settled anytime soon, but it's been around for a while. There are multiple versions of it. And why does it matter? Because identity is at the heart of what's going on in our world. I know it's a very glib generalization, but I think it would be fair to say that for much of the 20th century, the big political issues were economic or constitutional, redistribution of wealth, capitalism versus communism, all of that. Identity was still there, of course it was, but it was seen as something irrational, not something that could be quantified and measured and legislated upon. So identity took a little bit of a back seat for much of the 20th century. 21st century, we're no longer arguing over economics or constitutional affairs. We're arguing over our identities, over our emotions, and how fear, anxiety, hope, these things are underpinning so many of the problems that we're facing around the world, in Canada, in Europe, all across the planet. Identity has always been a part of the human experience, and it's always been significant. But the research that I'm doing here at King's College London, and I've just been doing there in Ottawa, the research I'm doing is looking at how we can understand these anxieties, these identity issues, to try and find solutions to the challenges that we face.
You mentioned it already. Last year, you spent several months at the Carleton University at Ottawa as the Konrad Adenauer Visiting Scholar on Transatlantic Relations. From your own assessment and your experiences from that time, what's the genuine interest of students in Europe? Is there a genuine interest of the students in Europe?
There absolutely is. Yes, I was very fortunate to spend some time in Ottawa last year, where I got to experience the whole range of Canadian weather. It was absolutely delightful. There certainly is a very strong interest in European identity among Canadians in general, not just Canadian students who I had the pleasure of teaching at Carleton. Canada is not America. It's not the United States. And a huge part of identity research is looking at the other side of identity. So if we imagine this like a coin, on the one face is identity, who we are. On the other side of it is alterity, who we are not. Now, this is a dialogue that has existed for thousands of years, the argument that you can only know who you are by knowing who you are not. Now, in Canada, a great part of that alterity of who we are not is we are not Americans, we are not the USA. And so there is a stronger, I would say, affinity for European culture, for European societies among Canadians than there might be, for example, found among citizens of the United States. So if we can, if we think about the relations between Canada and Europe more broadly, I mean, obviously, yes, Canada, former part of the British Empire, formerly part of the French Empire. So we can easily see, of course, a great connection between Quebec culture and French culture, a huge connection there. A very deep connection between Anglophone Canadians and the British. And I was actually rather surprised at how much Canadians were following British and European politics, far more than Americans would. So I did get a very strong sense that not only Canadian students, but Canadians in general are very, very culturally close to European societies, to a European identity, follow European developments and British developments quite a lot. So one thing that we've had, one problem that we've had in British universities in recent years is this discussion of, what's the point in studying Europe if the British are no longer part of the European Union? It's not an argument that's going to go away anytime soon. And I did wonder to what extent there would be a sense in Canada of, well, what's the point of studying Europe? We're not Europeans. It's on the other side of the planet. I was surprised and delighted to find that there was a far greater sense of community with Europeans among Canadians.
You referred to it already. Canada has historically strong ties to Europe. It has a European king. It has a political and a legal system with European roots. But how deep are these roots today?
I think they're very significant. And again, a part of this comes back to Canada not being the USA. So we saw similar phenomena around 20 years ago, when the global war on terror was at its apogee under the presidency of George W. Bush. And then we saw it again under the presidency of Donald Trump. And we're likely to see it again in the future. A sense among Canadians of a performance of not being American, of a performance of being simultaneously Canadian and European. So a lot of the research that I do looks at identity not just as an abstract phenomenon, but identity as performative. It's something you do. It's the clothes that you wear, the words that you use, the places that you shop, the food that you cook when you get in from work of an evening. And so much of this performance, uh, to call it performance doesn't mean that it's affected or fake. It's simply something that you're doing. And so much of this behavior of these performances of identity in Canada were very explicitly European. Because, okay, yeah, Canada is hundreds, thousands of miles away from Europe, but Canadians, British, Europeans, we live in the same style houses. Yours are a lot nicer, obviously. We live in the same sort of houses. We wear the same clothes. We speak the same language. We eat the same food. So this is something which is a sense of European-Canadian connection. Is something that does exist at the elite level, but it's also something that we find in the everyday level, far more significantly. So some of the research that I'm doing is using, and forgive my butchering of the German terminology here, but a lot of the work that I'm doing is looking at identity in the realm of Alltagsgeschichte and Außenpolitik. Now, Alltagsgeschichte is the sort of everyday, the realm of the banal, the mundane, the normal. Außenpolitik, yeah, I know technically it means foreign policy, but it can refer to the more sort of elite realm of politics. Parliaments, senates, elections, all that sort of stuff. Whereas Alltagsgeschichte is the everyday. So we've got one being the politics of the conference table and the other one being the politics of the kitchen table. And it's in that little everyday realm that a sense of being Europeans, a sense of being Canadians, a sense of, well, we're not Americans, but we're not completely separate from America. We're not completely separate from Europe. It's in those little everyday realms, just as it is for British identity, just as it is for European identity, that we get so many of those close connections between Canadians and Europeans.
In our work, the work of KS Canada with young Canadian academics, we have recently been confronted with the theory that Europe is to blame for all the suffering inflicted on the indigenous peoples of Canada in the last 2 centuries, and therefore the conclusion is Europe is not worth of academic study. Is that an academic aberration, or what do you think about this theory?
It's not an argument that I agree with, but it is an argument whose logic I can understand. So, yes, an argument can be made that Europeans have been entirely and unequivocally malevolent throughout our history, because, yes, it was the Europeans who took over the world through colonialism, through imperialism, through industrialization, and there is probably no limit to the atrocities and crimes that can be apportioned to European imperialism and colonialism. So you can see the logic of this argument. If Europeans have been malevolent, therefore we shouldn't study them because it is almost legitimizing what happened in the past. There is a logic to this argument, but I don't agree for 2 reasons. Now, the first point of disagreement would be it's a more philosophical argument than I am capable of making, but it essentially comes down to who is responsible for the past. Now, this is a debate that human societies have had probably for as long as there have been human societies. Are the present generations responsible for what their ancestors did? Now, there isn't an easy answer to this, but I'm very hesitant to go down the road of saying, all right, well, there were crimes committed in the past, therefore we shouldn't study this philosophy, because it can lead to existing generations being blamed for the past. I'm British, but I am not personally responsible for the crimes of the British Empire. You're German, but you are not personally responsible for the crimes of the German empires. So this is one reason that I'm reluctant to go with this argument. The second disagreement I would have with this argument is that it ends up whitewashing history. how can we understand the crimes of the past? How can we try and make restitution for the crimes of the past unless we study it, unless we understand what happened? I'm living in London right now, which is, still has enormous legacies of the empire. There in Ottawa, I remember being there just a few months ago. Monuments to the empire, memories of things that happened under British and French rule. If we are to say that we're not going to study these things because they're morally abhorrent, then we end up just deleting history. We can walk around the streets of Ottawa, Toronto, Quebec, London, and see the legacies of empire, the legacies of colonialism, and memories of what happened and the crimes that were committed. Are we to pretend that it didn't happen, to simply delete this? Because we cannot solve the legacies of empire. We cannot deal with the hangover of colonialism, what Samir Puri calls the Great Imperial Hangover. We can't deal with this unless we study it, unless we understand, or try to understand what happened. So your country is actually a very good example of this, because since Brexit, we've had an enormous debate going on in this country about facing up to the empire. It's not something that we ever really used to think about in British culture. In the late 20th, early 21st centuries, we just never really thought about the empire. And then all of a sudden it cropped up after Brexit. So we have never faced up to what we did. The Americans have never faced up to what they did. The French have never faced up to their empire and its legacies. Germany has. And again, I'm going to mangle this word, but the German phenomenon of Vergangenheitsbewältigung is something that ought to be replicated in other countries. Yeah, in Canadian culture, there is not enough consideration of the crimes that went on under imperial occupation. In British culture, in American, French, Spanish, Italian culture, there does need to be this German phenomenon of facing up to the past, but there is a fundamental difference between facing up to the past and taking blame for the past. And then an even more fundamental difference between facing up to the past or pretending that it didn't exist. How can someone be a scholar of history, of politics, if we just ignore and do not research that which is unpalatable?
From my personal and German point of view, a British person belongs to a nation which always wanted to dominate Europe historically, but never really wanted to belong to Europe. And is Brexit actually, was it an accident of history, or did it reflect a permanent undercurrent of British society?
Oh, I thought the first question was tough. This is an enormous debate that is still going on in British society. Now, in the last few years, really since the pandemic and the outbreak of war in Ukraine, Brexit has dropped out of our public debate and discourse. It's moved from the political science section to the history section. But this is a debate which has been going on for years. It was an enormous debate in 2016 and in the years following the Brexit vote, as we wrestled with our country just fighting a very British civil war in which we don't actually go to war with one another, we just block people on Facebook. So this was an enormous debate in British society, and there is still a significant element of this lying beneath the surface. Are the British uniquely Eurosceptic? Now, this is part of the research that I've been doing throughout my academic career. Do the British feel European? Do the British want to be Europeans? It almost comes back to your first question on what is a European identity. And it goes back to what I mentioned on how even in 2016, people like Nigel Farage were not saying we're going to leave Europe, we're going to leave the European Union. So have the British always been Eurosceptic? There is a huge body of evidence for this. We didn't join the project until the 1970s. Then once we got in, we were just difficult, demanding opt-outs, demanding rebates, just generally being annoying. I think that there was quite a sigh of relief in many European capitals when the British voted to leave, of thinking, oh, thank God they've gone. So, and of course, we can see a growing Euroscepticism in British domestic politics from the 1990s onwards. We had the referendum party in the 90s, then the growth of UKIP in the 2000s and the 2010s. So there was a huge body of evidence to say, look, Brexit was inevitable. It was always going to happen, that the British were going to leave because we just don't like Europe. This There's a bit of a trope, a cliche in British culture of the two world wars and one World Cup mentality. That we, as a consequence of the First and Second World Wars, we think that we're just different to Europe and somehow exceptional and better than Europe. So there is a very powerful argument to be made that Brexit was inevitable. The British were always going to leave. There's an equally powerful argument that can be made that no, there was nothing inevitable about it. We joined in the 70s not because we didn't want to, but because we weren't allowed in. In the era of Konrad Adenauer, in the era of Charles de Gaulle, it was de Gaulle who kept us from joining. When we were in the European Union, we pressed for expanding the membership to countries that had been occupied by that had been crushed under the Soviet jackboot, and it was the British who were campaigning for countries to join. And remember that we did have our first ever referendum in 1975, in which 2/3 of the British population voted to be in the European project. So there is and now, since Brexit, the British might be some of the most European people outside of the EU, because half of the country is more European than the European Union, wanted to get into the EU. So a powerful argument can be made that it was inevitable, it was always going to happen. An equally powerful argument can be made that no, it was not inevitable, because the British have not always been innately Eurosceptic. But a third argument is one that I subscribe to. When we held the vote in 2016, it wasn't a foregone conclusion. People talk about the British being uniquely and incredibly Eurosceptic. Well, for one thing, we're not uniquely Eurosceptic. There are other Eurosceptics in Europe, and the British are not overwhelmingly Eurosceptic. If the British hated Europe, then why did the Leave campaign win by 52%? If the British have always been Eurosceptic, then the Leave campaign should have won by 99%, not by 52%. But when that vote was held in 2016, I think that the Brexit vote was inevitable, but not in the way that we think. It wasn't inevitable because we hate the Europeans. It was inevitable because no matter what the referendum was about, we would have voted to leave something. If we had held a referendum on our membership of the United Nations or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or if we held a referendum on our membership in the International Postal and Telegraph Union, we probably would have voted to leave, because the vote in 2016 wasn't about the European Union. It was about us. It was about our lack of trust in our government, our sense of anger after a decade of austerity. It was about our frustration at not being a global superpower anymore. There is an element of that imperial nostalgia and a yearning for when the map was painted red. The day after the Brexit vote, so we all woke up on the Friday morning to hear that the British had voted to leave. Even Nigel Farage couldn't believe. Everyone thought Remain was going to win. When we all woke up on that Friday morning and switched on the TV or started doom scrolling through our phones to see that we'd voted to leave, the number one question that was Googled from the United Kingdom was, what is the European Union? We were not voting to leave the EU. We were voting as basically a protest, a cry of anger against the whole system. And yeah, is there a potential for it to change? Not anytime soon. I mean, we've got an election coming up. We all know how it's going to go. It's not going to be a question of who wins. It's going to be a question of how horrifically mauled are the Conservative Party going to get. When a new government comes in, they're going to have to renegotiate our relationship with the European Union, but there's no appetite for rejoining. So the question of Britain's relationship with Europe, it's dominated our politics for the last 8 years, and it's not going to go away anytime soon.
So what should Canadian political decision makers and the ordinary people in Canada conclude about Europe from Brexit? Is Europe just a bloc with opposing interests, rivalries, and different interests of the members, or is it, as a former KS chairman had titled his memoirs, "Fortunately, we are united for our happiness"? What is it?
That's a good name for a memoir. I like that. We could look at the motto of the European project itself, united in diversity. There is no single sense of European identity. There is no pro-EU, anti-EU sentiment, single sentiment across Europe. It's a very, very diverse civilization, continent, society. some things that outsiders, whether they're in Canada, whether they're in Vietnam or Egypt, looking from the outside at Brexit and what that says about the European vision, the European project. Again, to repeat what I just said, the British did not vote to leave because we're Eurosceptic. We voted to leave because we just desperately wanted to make our voice heard about something. There was a great sense of, well, depending on which side of the fence you're on, there was a great sense of either fear or hope that Brexit would lead to a domino effect, that there would be similar votes in the European project, because, I will hold up my hands and say, yeah, the European project does have problems. Um, Show me something created by humans that does not have problems with it. So there are legitimate criticisms that can be made of the European Union. But in 2016, people feared or hoped that there was going to be a domino effect across the European project, that they could capitalize on an anti-European sentiment, they could capitalize on a return to nationalism, a return to ethnic nationalism, anger at out-of-touch elitist governments, and that other countries would vote to leave. That didn't happen. Not only that didn't happen, but the exact opposite happened. Far from Europe fragmenting, it was the British who started to fragment as we just entered complete chaos and pandemonium. I was living in Britain throughout this period. You could not go 24 hours without hearing or reading the word Brexit. So we started to fragment, but Europe became much stronger, much closer. We are seeing the European Union starting to transform as a result of Brexit, and especially as a result of the invasion of Ukraine. We're seeing the European Union turning into a much more muscular organization. We're seeing it turning into much more of a foreign policy player than it had been before Brexit. So the British have always been a little bit of an aberration in the European project. We've always been the odd member. Stephen George famously described Britain in 1990, in the late 1990s, as the awkward partner, that the Europeans found us just annoying, and we found the European project irritating, but both sides got something out of it. So Brexit is not a sign of a wider sense of dissatisfaction with the European project in France, in Denmark, in Romania, what have you. But since Brexit, we can see one thing that we can see for Canadians looking at the EU, it proves just how resilient the European project is. Now, I did my PhD back in 2013. And I wrote my PhD with I've developed a theory that the European Union is not sui generis. It is not a one-of-a-kind organization. It's basically an empire, a good empire. This was back in 2013 when the British were able to sit on the fence about Europe rather than having to take sides on it. And since the global financial crisis in 2007, 2008, since the migration crisis, since the subprime mortgage lending crisis, all of these things, there have been predictions being made that any second now, the European Union is going to break apart. Europe is a dying organization. It's going to collapse once President Le Pen gets in, or once Viktor Orban decides that he wants to leave. People have been making this prediction for over a decade, that the European Union is at death's door. Not at all. It's stronger than it's been before. Partly that is because other Europeans have looked at what happened to the British, what we did to ourselves after 2016, have looked at us and thought, oh, we don't want to go through what the British are going through. So we are seeing the European Union emerging stronger. We're seeing it emerging as a much more potent foreign policy player. It's not going to be long until the European Union has got a far more integrated foreign policy, a defense policy. Because, of course, one thing that we're getting in recent years, well, not recent years, in recent weeks, is a realization that we have to defend ourselves now. We're probably going to see a closer relationship with Canada in foreign policy and defense, because we don't know how much longer either your side of the Atlantic or my side can rely on Uncle Sam. So in the aftermath of Brexit, the pandemic, the war, we're seeing a stronger Europe, a Europe which is far more interested in building a positive relationship with the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada. We don't know how much longer we can rely on the USA, but I'll end before the next question. I'll end on one possibly gloomy note of some work that I'm doing, some work I was doing at Carleton. The European Union is becoming stronger, but we have to be very careful about this, because since Brexit, no one wants to leave the European Union anymore. Marine Le Pen, Viktor Orban, Alternative for Deutschland, the Sweden Democrats, they don't want to leave the European Union. They want to take over the European Union and turn it into a fortress. So it's a double-edged sword. Europe is getting stronger, but if that gets taken over by the Euro alternativists, then it's going to make Brexit look like a playground argument.
Apart from invocations of common values on our side of the Atlantic and the other, what do Europe and Canada have in common to regain weight on the world political stage?
Well, I can return to an earlier answer I gave, which is that balance of Außenpolitik and Alltagsgeschichte. In the realm of the everyday, there are so many everyday connections between Canadians and Europeans, from the food that we eat, from the political systems that we have, all of these things. These are not going to go away anytime soon. So we've already got those very, very strong links. And then in the elite realm, in the realm of Außenpolitik, especially in foreign policy, we're going to see, I do predict we're going to see much greater cooperation, transatlantic cooperation between the European Union, the United Kingdom, and Canada. One reason, partly because we don't know how much longer we can rely on Washington. Another reason being that transatlanticism itself is starting to look a little narrow. In recent weeks, we've seen how we've seen much greater cooperation between NATO and AUKUS. We're seeing an increasing focus on the Pacific. Now, of course, Canada, you're on both sides. You've got coasts on both of these oceans. Britain and Europe hasn't. So we're likely going to see, regardless of who wins the White House later this year, regardless of what happens in America, I think we're going to see a much stronger cooperation between Canada, the UK, and the EU in the realm of foreign policy, in deterring authoritarian governments, and in taking a much more global outlook. We're probably going to see a return to Winston Churchill's old model, his overlapping three circles, in which we've got Europe, the Commonwealth, and the English-speaking world, which now is the whole world. And right in the middle of where those three overlap will be the United Kingdom. And, you know, after Brexit, we're desperate for friends. So I think that Ottawa is going to have a lot more door knocking happening from London.
The immigration of hundreds of thousands of people from non-European cultures will undoubtedly have consequences for everyday life in Canada, for the Canadian image of the state, for its foreign policies, just to name a few areas. What do you expect in terms of changes for Canada in the next 20 to 30 years?
I don't think Canada is going to have a unique experience. I think that Canada will have a very, very similar, probably identical experience to much of the developed world of this debate about immigration. Immigration has to happen because our birth rates are declining. You know, we can look at countries which have got declining birth rates and no immigration, namely Japan, South Korea, and China, where they are facing a total demographic collapse in the next in the next decade. So we have to have immigration. As you say, it's the everyday level where these debates are going on. In this country, there are huge arguments going on about immigration. I'm sure that your listeners have been following the chaos that we've had over the Rwanda scheme in the United Kingdom. You've got the elite arguments that go on about immigration, the economic aspect, the birth rate aspect. There's also the everyday ones. The cost of rent in overcrowded cities. I only found out the other day that Toronto is one of the most expensive cities in the world. So a lack of infrastructure, crumbling public services, a general lack of housing, maybe a shortfall of jobs and education. It's those little everyday things where the tensions rise. So I think that Canada is going to experience a very similar phenomenon. No matter how quickly we build houses, no matter how much we change the curricula in schools, there's going to be growing tensions as competition increases for limited housing, limited jobs, whatever. But of course, there's also going to be the cultural arguments being made, not just the rational things that policymakers can deal with, like building more houses or building new motorways. It'll be a return to Samuel Huntington's old theory from the early 2000s of a clash of civilizations. That is not something that Canada is immune to. And in that regard, the Canadians are going to end up, if not already, the Canadians are going to be having the same increasingly polarized, increasingly nasty arguments that are going on in European countries, and I include the United Kingdom in that, and south of the border in the United States, over whether and how a balance can be struck between the need for immigration to stave off a demographic collapse versus the cultural clashes that may occur.
Now in the next month, start again. European elections are due next June. Again, what do you expect from the result in terms of Europe's internal state of mind and its relationship with Canada?
I think that we'll see a similar phenomenon to 2014 in the European Parliament elections then, which returned a significantly more Eurosceptic Parliament than had existed before. The 2019 elections were dominated by discussion of the British and our membership. The European Parliament is not particularly powerful. It's the executive and the Commission which hold nearly all of the power. So the European Parliament has very limited abilities, but it is a very good litmus test of European popular sentiment. So it's not the case, even if all of the Eurosceptic, even if every seat is won by a Eurosceptic, it's not going to make that much difference because they don't have that much power. But it is going to be an indicator of how Europeans feel. It's the national elections that we should be following much more closely. It's going to be interesting to see the result from the French electors in the European elections. I think it is going to return a more Eurosceptic Parliament, but again, going back to what we were talking about earlier, not Eurosceptics who want to leave the project, Eurosceptics who want to take over the project. Because going back to the question that you just asked on immigration, the Euro-alternativist outlook is that Europe is besieged. And therefore, a lot of these people want to take over the apparatus and the institutions of Europe. In terms of our relationship, how it will affect our relationship with Canada, I say our, and I'm not even in the European Union. The transatlantic relationship is going to be increasingly important for both sides because neither your country nor mine nor the Europeans can rely for much longer on America. So we are going to see, I predict that we are going to see a closer cooperation, a closer desire for Ottawa, London and Brussels alongside Sydney and Auckland to work together to resolve some of the challenges that we're facing. Some of the challenges that you've mentioned there, demographic decline, the challenges of immigration, economics, global security and foreign policy. So the European elections themselves will have limited significance, but they will be a litmus test of how Europeans are feeling. But regardless of who wins, I think that we're going to see your country, my country and Europe working a lot more closely together.
Dr. Russell Foster, thank you very much for this conversation.
It's been a delight.
Thank you for joining us for our latest episode of Canada mit C. If you'd like to learn more about the work of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Canada and stay tuned for upcoming events, publications and more, you're welcome to check out our homepage and sign up for our quarterly newsletter at www.ks.de/Canada. Thank you, and we look forward to welcoming you back in our next episode of Canada mit C.